ever had an experience that suggested someone else was in your house and just thought, I don't want to know, and left it be? Sometimes, fear of the unknown just seems like the preferable option to facing a real, concrete danger. Normally it's nothing though. One time, the beeper function of my wireless house phone went off when I was the only one home. It could only be called from the living room. Another time, I swear someone took some change from my desk. They're all probably just slightly disconcerting tricks of the memory. But what would you do when something truly suggestive happens? Would you run or just ignore it like I did? Last Monday was a normal day. I got up, brushed my teeth, changed into school clothes, all little parts of my morning ritual. It seemed like it would be another totally unnoteworthy day until I saw the strings. There were 3 or 4 thick twine strings in my room. They crisscrossed between the walls around my bed, one attached to the door. No way would I have missed them before. I should have tripped over them. They were tied to pins in the walls, which had also not existed before 10 seconds ago. Nobody could have been in my room while I was in it, let alone set this up. It was early and my brain wasn't processing correctly. I simply discredited the sight, untied the strings, and left for school, leaving them balled up on my desk. It didn't get any better later. There were hundreds of them outside my house, tied between houses, around cars, across streets. This had to be some super elaborate prank, one of those hidden camera shows or a comedy improv block. They had gotten everyone else to play along too. Passers-by were tangled in them, tying them to objects they were walking towards and away from, as if they had been and were continuing to follow the course laid out for them. I nervously continued my journey to school. On the bus, everyone except me was tied to the door. At school, groups of students were tied to each other. Teachers were tied to their desks and boards. Oddly enough, at this point, all I could wonder was why I had been left out. When my friend Lucy sat beside me in first period, she simply plunked her back down on my lap and rested her chin in her hand, looking right past me to the window outside. "Hey Lucy." No response. "Come on, I didn't expect you to be in on this too." She sighed and started taking books from her bag. All the books were tied to her hands. I grinned and yanked one of the strings off a book. She didn't seem to notice, instead simply disregarding the book completely, letting it drop to the floor without a moment's hesitation. I leaned down, picked up her book and placed it back on her desk. She took no notice. "Well, if that's how we're gonna play it," I smiled, trying to look playful, but really just trying to hide my nervousness. I bundled all of the strings attached to her together with one hand, then pulled them all free. She blinked, turning to stare at me. "Holy crap, Martin, you're like a ninja or something." "I've been sitting here for maybe 10 minutes, I smiled again, relieved my friend had finally noticed me. "Where did all these strings come from?" she gasped, seemingly noticing for the first time. "I assumed all of you were messing with me." She stood up, backing into a corner. No one else in the class noticed. "They weren't here just a minute ago. Do you see them too?" Her tone made it clear she was genuinely scared. "No, didn't you?" I was interrupted by my teacher slamming the door behind her. Everyone except me and Lucy murmured a good morning, and still, no one seemed to pay either of us any notice. People have been ignoring me all day, I said to Lucy before turning to our teacher. Hey, dumbass, you can't teach for shit. No reaction. I'm getting away from all this crap. Lucy pulled a few strings aside and left the class. I followed, and surprise, surprise, no one else noticed. We wandered the corridors, leaving and entering classes as we saw fit. Whenever we untied a chair or book from someone else, it was like it suddenly didn't matter to them. It didn't exist. I showed her the street outside. There were more strings than when I came in this morning. Twice as many. We carefully picked our way through the tangle, making our way to a nearby coffee shop. Not particularly grand, I know, but what would you do in our situation? As I said, fear of the unknown sometimes seems like the safer option. On a few occasions, I suggested we untie a few more people. Lucy was opposed to it, remembering how terrified she'd been. In the coffee shop, we grabbed a couple of sandwiches and drinks from the fridge. We found a table, untied all the strings attached to the chairs, and sat down. We both ate in silence, both of us too scared, both of us distracting ourselves by watching the strangers in the shop, oblivious to the strings. After 20 minutes, Lucy spoke up. Now she's gonna take that sandwich, she said, pointing at the woman across the shop. Sure enough, she walked to the fridge and took the plastic-wrapped sandwich she was tied to. She pays for it and leaves. She did so, according to the prophecies of the strings. That guy doesn't intend to pay. I watched as a man took his coffee and ran out of the store. The two servers just looking too exasperated to go after him. This is horrible, she whimpered. Let's go, please. Outside was much better. Everyone just followed the string's instructions, going about their daily lives. Lucy announced she was going home to sleep this off, and I agreed to walk her home. She only lived 10 minutes away. Away from the busier part of town, there were fewer strings. It was nicer. We could pretend it wasn't happening. When we turned onto Lucy Street, she stopped, her mouth falling open. What now? I broke the silence, my voice sounding surprisingly small. Look, she pointed outside of one of our neighbors' houses. I saw it clearly, and I'll take my memory of that moment till the day I die. A little dark imp, maybe 3 feet tall, walking along with his knuckles on the ground, almost like a monkey. It had 2 bulbous yellow eyes taking up about half of its face, and no mouth or other facial features. It was holding a hammer and a ball of twine, which was letting out behind it. It walked quickly and quietly from the front door of the house to the mailbox. It stopped, hammered a nail into the side of the box, and tied its string around it. It turned to face us and stopped when it spotted us. My bottom jaw dropped even further than it had already been, but it just stared with a look of surprise and curiosity. You could almost say it was the more frightened one. Suddenly, it beckoned to us with its tiny hand. I looked at Lucy. She hadn't moved. I looked back at the imp, which stared at me. I halved the distance between us and then halved it again. This wasn't fear of the unknown anymore. It was fear of this little guy. Didn't seem like anything to be scared of. When I was a meter away from it, it extended its hand. Hi. I shook it. It nodded in approval, blinking its massive yellow eyes up at me. So, you're the ones in charge of the strings? It nodded eagerly. I called Lucy over, but she stayed where she was. There are more of you, another not. I wanted to ask it so many questions about what it was and where it came from, but it seemed, for now, I was stuck with only yes or no questions. Do we even have free will? It just looked at me, almost sadly. I immediately felt sick to my stomach and couldn't bear looking at the little monster anymore. I grabbed Lucy, who had been listening to our exchange and now sat on the curb with her head in her hands. Come on. We entered her house and I made her a cup of tea. When I found her in the living room, she had untied her dog and was curled up with it, crying. I set the tea down and sat beside her. I'm so scared, she whispered after a good 10 minutes of sobbing. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I'm going to sleep, she mumbled suddenly, and was under within the minute. Sleep was starting to sound pretty good all of a sudden. My eyelids suddenly felt like they were being weighted down. I collapsed onto the rock, and the last thing I heard before I fell asleep was the scurrying of several sets of little feet nearby. I felt much better the next day, as if the whole affair had been a dream. I'd probably have believed that if I hadn't been awoken by Lucy's mother that morning, wondering what I was doing sleeping over without permission. Over breakfast, Lucy asked me why I looked so pale and nervous. I turned to her and smiled, mumbling something to her about feeling sick. But the truth was, I was scared because I couldn't see any strings, and was wondering whether my actions were truly my own. I fear the hulking giant that waits just outside my home. I'm too afraid to even look up at him in his full size. He stands 2, maybe 3 stories tall, silently watching me, his silhouette a pitch black void against the starry night sky. At any moment, he could rip through this flimsy shelter I call home, like a dull knife through skin. So why doesn't he? Why doesn't he get it over with already, instead of staring me down? Because he's waiting for me to go outside, so he may crush me and put me out of my misery. Giving in to him seems more and more appealing as time goes by. Because as much as he scares me, there are more of them out there. A lot more. Some smaller, some even bigger. They're all around you too, and you know they are. I don't know how you can even ignore them. They're everywhere. If you look out your window right now, you can see one if you're lucky, dozens of them if you are unlucky. You might even have a few lining your driveway. You might even have a tire swing hanging off one of their branches. My name is Dr. Adam Collier, and I am afraid of trees. You may think it's funny or unusual, but I promise you that by the time I am done telling you my story, you will fear them as much as I do. You'll have to forgive me for any pauses or slip-ups you may hear in this recording. I am trying as best as I can to recount everything in one take, with as much detail as possible. As I said, I am a doctor, specifically a doctor in chemical engineering. I am a research and development technician for the Olithra Company in Silverside, Delaware. My team and I are responsible for developing and testing prototypical chemicals for all sorts of things, really. I suppose the NDA doesn't matter anymore. I was working on synthesizing a form of carbonic anhydrase to offset carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. But Even the best test results out of all of my trials required L-aspartate, fatty acids, uracil, L-arginine, and, the force of habit. I'll try to refrain from using too much technical jargon from here on out. What I meant to say is that after a series of failures, the closest thing I could come up with still required too much to be feasible. I asked my new assistant, Dr. Anna Numers, to contain and dispose of the chemical, as I had deemed it a failure. But, unknown to me at the time, she continued to perform tests with it. She theorized that the desired reaction could occur if the compound was introduced to isoenzymes if she provided the compound with organic plant matter to consume. She took some of the byproducts of my tests and made them into a mixture of her own, and she put some of that mixture onto a fern she kept on her desk, completely against protocol and off the record. She told me all this later, after her own tests had failed to produce anything. Let's just say that they had failed as well. Not only did she break a dozen rules, but she also failed to create anything that could even be considered close to a success for our purposes. Looking back now, I should have fired her. She did show me something entirely unexpected and deeply interesting. The chemical had not eaten away at her fern, as she expected. In fact, the fern that she claimed was almost dead had sprouted new leaves, quite a few actually. At the risk of being penalized for my own assistant's actions, I accidentally reported this to my superiors. Instead of punishing me, they encouraged me to perform more tests. They saw the potential for this as a new fertilizer. From that point on, things moved quickly. Our entire team ran more tests on the original compound I had made. It turns out the chemical was more than just a decent fertilizer. We saw a 2% increase in the rate of construction of plant cells. Once my team published our findings, funding started flooding in from all over. Government agencies, farming corporations, and agrochemical powerhouses were all jumping at the bit. Our findings could impact food shortages or help places that couldn't regularly grow crops. It wasn't too much of a stretch to say that our research could have solved world hunger. With all the funding and more than enough manpower thrown at this, we pressed on to the prototype development phase. Everything seemed fine. There were no issues and no downsides. We further engineered the chemical to make the affected plants drought and frost resistant as well. We even devised a means of controlled distribution. 2 dizzying months later, we conducted the first tests on outdoor crops. Tests proceeded admirably, but this latest batch grew a little too fast. And more concerning, our control crops, which should have been untouched by the chemical, also showed accelerated growth. We determined that the test plants themselves were producing their own version of the chemical, which must have spread to the control crops by being carried on the wind. Or perhaps it had penetrated deep into the soil, or maybe some bees had carried it across fields. We weren't exactly sure. Regardless of how it reached them, leaves and stems on all plants in both testing plots were growing 5 to 10% faster at a cellular level. Unfortunately, it wasn't just the test and control crops that were affected. 2 days later, we noticed that the forest surrounding the test fields had grown 50 yards closer. That's when we knew we had a problem on our hands. HazMat was called in to do a cleanup. They burned down all plant life and salted the soil 200 yards into the surrounding forest. They also burned and salted the test and control crops as well. While it was an embarrassing mistake, we were relieved that it was successfully contained. Our relief only lasted a few days. The forest was back to where it was originally in just 2 days. This extreme rate of growth made no sense, and to make matters worse, it wasn't contained. There was evidence that it had spread even further than the woods. Faster growth meant more dispersal of plant matter, which potentially meant more plants were getting tainted with the chemical. HazMat was called in again, but this this time the damage was too widespread. Within days, plants all around Bryn Mawr County showed signs of hyperactive growth. On my morning drive to work, the same blind turn that I had taken dozens of times before was blocked by a giant branch that would have surely killed me if I had not stopped in time. The branch wasn't there the day before, I'm sure of it. The next day, the road was closed. In just a few short days, there were reports of major roads being swallowed up by greenery as far as 15 miles from our testing site. And it was still spreading, but we still didn't know how. We think the wind must have picked up the pollen or leaves or seeds of tainted plants and carried them all over the state, maybe even further. The Eleuthera company called in an emergency response force the size of a small army. They burned and salted as much greenery as they could, not leaving anything to chance. Hundreds of trained professionals managed a controlled fire. The company's ties to the outbreak still hadn't reached the public, but when the massive cloud of smoke blocked out the sun, reporters came to the largest chemical company in the tri-state area for answers. And that was Eleuthera. Some news outlets claimed the extreme overgrowth was a result of a bioweapon test gone wrong, or an international act of terrorism. Some even reported that it was a sign of the end times. Panic spread across the nation, and so did the chemical. The first reports of accelerated growth in the redwood forest on the west coast came out in just 2 short weeks. We didn't know enough about it. Nobody did. Was it the wind that was spreading the chemical? Was it bees? Was it people? The government didn't want to take any risks. All flights and boats out of the country were shut down. The United States tried to quarantine the overgrowth. Reports of property damage flooded into news agencies. Top-heavy trees were toppling over and crushing people's homes. Tree branches were breaking in through windows and piercing walls. Apartment buildings were being torn apart by roots plunging into their foundation. I remember the first story of a direct death caused by the plants, all too vividly. Brendan Waters was an elderly, bedridden man staying at the Woodford Manor nursing home. He woke up one day to find that his small room was being invaded by wiry vines. Those same vines were thickest around his bed, where they had coiled themselves around his legs. He tried to pull them off, but they were so thick and he was so weak that he couldn't. He called for help, but the nurses were unable to get into his room. A patchwork of vines and roots had barricaded the metal door from the inside. Brendan could only weakly shout for help. Hours passed like this. We know every detail of the agony that Brendan went through, because the nurses were right on the other side of his door as he screamed about the cause of his pain for 35 excruciating hours. The vines that tied him down sprouted sharp thorns that tore into his legs as they crawled further and further up his frail body. The fire department was called in. Firefighters tried going in through the 3rd floor window, but an immense tree completely blocked it. The same window that Brendan asked his nurse to keep open on beautiful days was how the overgrowth got into his room in the first place. Firefighters worked in shifts to chop through the thicket surrounding the window, but it was much too slow, and the branches got thicker the more they chopped. Roots squeezed Brendan's chest. The firefighters cleared out the entire nursing home and went to work, tearing down the wall nearest Brendan's bed. He couldn't feel his legs anymore. When they eventually opened up a hole into his room, they still had to contend with a mesh of pale roots on the other side. Brendan cried out for his family. None of them were there. By the time the firefighters finally carved through the thicket, Brendan was no longer screaming. His body had been pierced by dozens of sharp, tiny branches. There was no blood on the scene. The news reported that his face had bright green leaves growing out of it by the time the coroner arrived. That report came out a month ago. Many more have suffered the same fate since. The country fully succumbed to panic. Many attempted to burn the aggressive forest down themselves. Gasoline became more useful for starting fires than it was for cars. All major roads were blocked anyway. So many people died in these amateur-controlled fires, and they died for nothing. The plants just grew back even faster. And it wasn't just people that were falling victim to the overgrowth. Greedy tree limbs grabbed power lines, causing power outages everywhere. Communications eventually went dark too. Thirsty roots pierced the water pipes, and they soon went dry. The overgrowth took so much. Too many people have listened to the screams of their loved ones slowly being strangled by bright green leaves. All they could do was abandon them or join them. People tried to retreat to deserts, but even the deserts showed more and more signs of overgrowth. We've made sure that plants treated by our chemical could be used in places where it's hard to grow crops after all. They are drought and frost resistant too. Who knows what the death count is at now? I'm sure I don't want to know. I was shipped off to the Asmussen Scott South Pole Station in Antarctica by the US government a few days before the borders were closed. Some of the original research teams were flown out here too. We were working on modifying the original chemical, attempting to turn it into an herbicide. They even flew in Dr. Nemmers too. It was clear that she was in way over her head. I should have fired her. Our team wasn't sure if the overgrowth had reached anywhere outside of North America by that point. We hoped it hadn't. But a French scientist at the United Nations flew and confirmed what we all feared. The overgrowth had crossed the ocean. She and her team traced the chemical to algae that had made its way to their shores via fish. Her wife was crushed to death by a falling tree. Her name was Julia. Disturbing questions spread throughout our makeshift research team. If fish could carry the chemical all the way from North America to Europe, how long before it made its way to other continents? How long before it made its way here? These international scientists provided invaluable information for our research. We saw some debatably hopeful results, but they were coming much too slow. We were all desperately fighting the nagging fear that we are much too late. But as the foremost experts on the chemical, if we couldn't figure out how to stop the overgrowth, who could? One day, I overheard the guards talking about the Antarctic coast having a green shore that wasn't there before, climbing up the ice walls of the glaciers. The research team and I tried to ignore these reports, hoping they weren't true. We had to ignore them and focus on getting the herbicide to work as fast as possible. But hastiness is what got us into this mess in the first place. So we ignored the guards. We ignored the fact that they started carrying flamethrowers. We ignored the way their numbers gradually decreased. We ignored the green fuzz cresting over the mountainside and how it crept closer each day. We ignored the streaks of green in the snow that appeared in our footprints as we made our way from our quarters to the lab. Dr. Nemmers didn't come into the lab one day, even though we couldn't afford days off. I had to ignore the thick teal moss that covered her like a blanket when I went to check on her in her quarters. I should have fired her. Less of my team showed up to work as days went on. They might have felt this plan wasn't going to work and decided to go out on their own terms. I had to ignore the splotchy moss that covered their quarters and how it might have meant that they didn't go willingly at all. I have to ignore all of these things and focus on my work, because if I don't... There is one thing I can ignore though, and it's standing about 60 feet away from me. Is it closer than it was yesterday? I first saw it as I was walking in the hall. I passed the window and saw a sharp green antenna poking out of the snow. I didn't think algae could form structures like that. A few hours later, I saw what I could only describe as leaves form on its ends, like lopsided veins. This was surely a new kind of plant life that has never existed before. It would be considered beautiful if the circumstances were different, if there was anyone besides me around to see it. But it looms out there, silently watching me, standing 2-3 stories tall, waiting for me to go outside so it can put me out of my misery. Silently watching me, its blue-green skin a vulgar wound against the pure white snow. It waits just outside these walls. I had always loved horror movies. In my younger days, I may have not realized it, but I was a glutton for the terror that the films would instill in me. I subconsciously loved how they kept me up at night, small fearful eyes scanning my bedroom shadows for whatever sort of creature may be calling the darkness its home. It was to the point where I would wake up in the early hours of the morning, around 1 a.m. or so, to sneak into the instill room and watch the late night screamers that would air. Often I would get caught by my mother or father about half an hour into my shenanigans, seated on the couch and wrapped in my blankie, while clutching a teddy bear with eyes fixated on the television screen. It never did. My parents were too tired at the time to actually remember apprehending me. On a rare occasion, though, I'd managed to make it all the way through a film, from the time I'd slipped into the couch to the moment the credits rolled. At that point, the trudge back to my bedroom was a mad dash of fright, trying to evade any and all monsters or bugaboos that in my impressionable mind would grab at me and take me away. I was always successful on the return trip. It made me feel like Indiana Jones. I don't love horror films anymore, not after what happened. I was in college when the event occurred. While most people associate university with wild parties, copious amounts of alcohol, and finding as many people to sleep with as possible, my version of the experience was more tame by those standards. The evenings not spent furiously poring over my projects and classwork were spent with my one true love, my Netflix account. From the moment my last class of the day ended, I was wrapped in the sweet embrace the internet had waiting for me. I would return to my dorm, slip into my bedroom, and wear something more comfortable, spend until about 4 in the morning watching whatever horrors the streaming site had available to me. And for the price of $8 a month, it was the best and cheapest addiction I'd ever encountered. The people I chose to interact with when I wasn't glued to my laptop were often of the same ilk that I was. Individuals who were just as obsessive over movies. We loved to be scared, and we often spoke of it. We compared reviews, discussed theories, and often got together to partake in this species of nightmare fuel, usually once a week on a Saturday, in a grand marathon session that was catered by the local pizza place, and a large snack trip beforehand to prepare for when we were sick of the smell of grease and cheese. Many of us were members of a horror enthusiast forum to meet and talk with more people who shared our twisted ideas of entertainment. I've since removed myself completely from that site. Due to the vast duration of time that I've been with my Netflix account, I'd practically exhausted their selection of movies to stream that were to my taste. I'd watched the classics, the cult favorites, the flops, the silent, the screamers, the spookers, the slashers, the foreign. Short of paying extra for a DVD plan, my partner in crime was becoming repetitive. I'd even resorted to watching the one-stars, the films that were too terrible to even consider horror, but still somehow made the list, filled with poorly crafted CG effects that were more terrifying than the monsters they were trying to scare me with. I lamented this to my forum mates, complaining of the lack of fresh choices on the site that filled my browser history. Many of my friends from school were having the same problems and were voicing their woes within the same thread that I had begun. Looking back on it, I realized now that this was the worst mistake I could have ever made. Had I not started that thread, some of us might have still remained among the living, finding new ways to garner our thrills. Scream Queen 69, our username from the forum, as I won't refer to anyone by their true name to protect families, approached us at the meeting grounds the following day. Our usual location of gathering was behind the campus building, an area of concrete that sloped downwards to a door that we all assumed led to the art department basement. The top of the wall that enclosed our cold stone hill blocked off by a fence, so no one could accidentally fall and injure themselves. As our group sat and talked, SQ arrived, looking a little worse for wear. She looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her face was pale. She often looked so bright and sun-kissed, full of energy, but not this time. She had said that shortly after she posted on the forums the night before, she'd been contacted by another member, asking if she wanted to watch something that, as she spoke and gave air quotes with her fingers, would change the genre for her forever, and then proceeded to send her a link to an obscure site she'd never heard of before. Tween Wolf rolled his eyes, suggesting that they were only trying to suggest a film for her to watch, and that she was being crazy for ignoring them. I was growing concerned, however, as she recounted that though she originally ignored the person, they sent her messages constantly afterwards. They started out mildly enough, along the lines of, "Did you watch it? And what did you think?" And as the night went on, they got more violent. SQ showed me the chat history, and towards the end, it seems that her chat partner, named Behind You, was getting more and more agitated. The messages were becoming desperate. "Did you click the link yet? You should click the link. You won't regret it. Click the link. Click on the damn link already. Click the bloody link. Click the 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 link." It was at this point that I grew incredibly concerned for my friend. No one else had received these messages, only her. My only advice to her was to ignore it and perhaps stay off the site for a few days. If this person didn't see her online, perhaps they would lose interest and back off. It wasn't the case, however, as SQ would come to us for the next couple of days looking more and more haggard, saying that she couldn't rest at night. Behind You was still messaging her, and at this point it was just a repeat of the original link, pasted over and over and over. She was starting to get emails sent to her school email account. She didn't know how they got in it. Her email address wasn't listed on the forum, and it wasn't even the same one she'd registered to the site with. The sender would be blank, the subject line empty, and the message was always the same: "Click the link." Her inbox was flooded with at least 100 emails by the time she returned from classes, all the same. And then the texts, an unknown number of all zeros at all hours of the day. "Click the link." Even when her phone was on silent, the sound would still ring out. It was turned off and it will ring. She would remove the battery completely and still be startled by the noise of her text tone. She had submerged her phone in water to try and damage it and get rid of the noise. Still, it rang. She had put it in the microwave and turned it on for 5 minutes, knowing that if the appliance was broken, she would have to pay for a replacement, seeing as the appliance was provided by the dorm building. Even burned and melted in places, the battery removed and fried, it rang. It was getting to the point where SQ was growing more and more frazzled. He each and every cell phone going off around her, causing her to shriek. By the 5th day, she hadn't shown up to lunch. Most of us assumed she was just trying to catch up on sleep from the incident keeping her up at night. We didn't realize she had died until 2 days later when her roommate complained about the smell coming from her room. The police blocked off the dorm room and her roommate was moved out to live with someone else in the building. They ruled it as a suicide, claiming that SQ had overdosed on sleeping pills. She had been found slumped over on her desk in front of her laptop with the forum pulled up on her browser. I had managed to worm my way into her room a few days after the cleanup had ended. Her family lived on the other side of the country and wouldn't be in for another day or two to gather her things. And I had convinced the building RA that Scream Queen 69 had had a few of my items, and I just needed to get them back before they were mistakenly removed with her belongings. The RA had left me there, saying that the doors would lock behind me once I left. Alone, in the room where my friend had passed, I removed the laptop from her desk, not wanting to sit on her death throne, and moved it over to the bed. SQ never kept her items password protected and left herself log in on everything, so it was easy enough to turn the computer on and navigate my way back to the very forum she had been looking at when she died. I had found my way to her inbox, looking at the hundreds of messages from her apparent stalker, when I noticed something different. Out of the mass of links, one of them was purple. It had been clicked. I grew curious. What was it about this movie that made this person so obsessive to show it to SQ? Was it the thing that had driven SQ to kill herself? I clicked the link. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The video was dark, as though it were trying to slowly process the images. Then things were starting to come into focus. A desk, posters on the wall, a person sitting on the bed, a person standing behind them with a large toothy grin. It was at this point that I realized I was staring at my own face, sitting in SQ's bedroom, her posters behind me. The webcam light was on.